Okay. All right, so this is kind of a brief supplemental lecture about Fluxus, and I'm recording this without having completely finished my notes and everything that I want to do to make this a full lecture, because we have a cool opportunity where we have a piece at our Springfield, Missouri Art Museum by Yoko Ono called Mending Piece. So she was a big part of the Fluxus movement, and I put this lecture together just to familiarize you a little bit with the concept behind Fluxus and with some of the major artists and individuals who were part of the movement. And then I'm going to flesh it out a little more later. But basically, I want to take you all to the Springfield Art Museum, or encourage you to go on your own time and check out this piece, because it's pretty cool. She's a pretty major artist and a very internationally famous individual, so to have one of her works at our museum is pretty cool. And the piece is called Mending Piece, and it's interactive, so you get to actually engage with the work, which is pretty rad. Okay, so let's talk about Fluxus and what Fluxus is. Basically, it was a art movement. No surprise there, that's what we're talking about. It would fit in with you can put it with either modernism, some people might put it with what we call postmodernism, but basically it's a 20th century movement that's still going on today that originates in the 1960s and predominantly in America and in Japan. Other places as well, but it really takes off in the States and in Japan. So we're going to talk about some of the different artists and learn a little bit about it. So it's an international, interdisciplinary community of artists, of composers, of designers, and poets during the 1960s and the 1970s who engaged in experimental art performances which emphasize the artistic process over the finished product. So in some movements that we've looked at this semester, we've had people beyond just visual artists who have participated. When we think about Surrealism, Andre Breton, Georges Bataille were both writers who were very involved. When we think about the intersection with the Bauhaus between designers and architects and artists, that kind of thing. With Fluxus, it's one of the movements, and kind of one of the first movements to really engage with performance art. And because of that, and because of the ideas behind it, there's a lot of input from musicians as well. So we have lots of musicians, composers, poets, and visual artists all working in this this new kind of movement. The name comes from a few different places. The main one is the Latin word fluxus, means flowing. In English, flux is a flowing out. The founder of Fluxus, there are several people who are really important and foundational to the movement, but the guy who's kind of considered the founder is George McCunis, and he said the purpose of Fluxus was to promote a revolutionary flood and tide in art and promote living art. He sometimes defined it as anti-art, but it's kind of art that's part of how you experience the world. So there's some influence here, obviously, from Dada. There's some pretty strong connections there, but again, this is in the 1960s, so it's, 40 years later. Okay, so let's look at some of this. Fluxus vocabulary, the kinds of things that are incorporated into creating Fluxus art. Some of them are new concepts entirely. One of the big parts were events and festivals. So these would be things that people could attend, because a lot of the kind of process-oriented part of Fluxus is not just that it's process-oriented for the artist or composer. The process also involves participation and community. So there were lots of events and festivals. There were also things called happenings. These would be kind of performances, like pop-up performances and sort of surprise event kind of things. There were things called Flux Kits. This is a picture of a Flux Kit on the slide here. And that would be a kit that would be sent to you by mail that would have a collection of different small art pieces by different Fluxus artists, or it would have kind of ingredients that you could put together to create your own art, okay? So part of it is this sort of mail art, which is another one of our vocabulary phrases up here, is sending things by mail. And so the person receiving it through the mail usually had something that they then had to do, and that's sort of the kind of participation. experimental notations. This is a lot to do with experimental compositions and music and performances. Flux shops were little pop-up shops, but they weren't really like shops. Usually it wasn't that you were buying things, you would go in and barter for things. There'd be some kind of community aspect to it. Concrete poetry was a type of poetry that was utilized heavily in this movement. Mail art would be things like mailing flux kits, also mailing like postcard art, that kind of thing, sending art through the mail. A flux box and a flux kit are kind of the same thing. A flux box would often more be a collection of art by different Fluxus artists. Intermedia is this idea of utilizing, this is kind of the dawn of a lot of the technology, computer technology, video technology, things like this. So Intermedia was this idea of using different kinds of experimental new media together to make art. Conceptualism, this is really the movement that kind of kicks off conceptualism as an art movement. Performance art has heavy ties to Fluxus, and then this whole idea of collaboration, of the author being less important because it's very process focused, so a collaboration between different artists and a collaboration between artists and members of the general public and community. So let's look at some of the influential people. One of the most influential artists in Fluxus is a composer, and his name was John Cage. So John Cage is pretty famous. His given name when he was born was John Milton Cage Jr., and he was an American composer and a music theorist, and he was a pioneer of indeterminacy in music, electroacoustic music, and non-standard use of musical instruments. And so he's someone who was a composer, was like a classically trained musician, but he would do compositions where it'd be like the orchestra sits and there's like 35 minutes of silence, or part of the composition would be like water dropping into a sink, or someone taking a bucket of nails and pouring it on the floor, then sitting on a piano. Very unconventional kinds of instructions. So he was super influential, and he had a lecture workshop series that a lot of the Fluxus artists attended, so he was quite influential. So this is an example of one of his music notation. So if you read music, this is pretty strange. So this was a pretty normal kind of work that he does. Right now in April of 2022, when I'm recording this, our symphony in Springfield is going to perform some of John Cage's arrangements at the Springfield Art Museum. One of those dates is coming up on April 22nd, and I think the other one is this Saturday, April, I want to say 16th. Check the Springfield Art Museum for information on when those things are, but you can go and see some of these performances. Okay, George McCunis is someone who is considered kind of one of the originators, one of the founders of Fluxus, and he was a Lithuanian-American artist, and he was kind of the central coordinator of Fluxus. I'd say he and John Cage. John Cage was very, very influential to all of these people, so I sort of start with him. He's most famous for originating the idea of happenings, these kind of pop-up events that would be like performance art or a poetry reading or a performance of a composition or like a live art performance or something like this. He's sort of originated those ideas, and then artist multiples, where each artist would make a bunch of multiples of the same thing, and then he would mail them out in those flux boxes to people. So he sort of originated that idea, and he coordinated a lot of things. He also wrote their manifesto. We're in the 20th century. Everybody's got a manifesto, right? We've kind of talked about this. Okay, so here's an example of one of his flux boxes. So in it, you have these pieces, and some of them have instructions from different artists. Some of them are little film loops that you can see. There'd be like a viewer that you could pull them through so you could see the little, it's kind of like a GIF before a GIF was something that we could have electronically. And there are all these different kinds of prompts and different sort of things. And so he did quite a few of these, and he would put them together and mail them out. This is maybe his most famous piece. So this is a piece that he made that's a screen print, and it's a political piece. So that's one of the other aspects of Fluxus, is some of the Fluxus artists are very politically engaged. Okay, so they're what we'd call instrumentalist art, right? So this one is the USA surpasses all the genocide records, and then it has all the massacre numbers from these other leaders and countries and things, and is saying that the United States has now surpassed all of these genocide records of other leaders at the time. So he was very critical of what the United States was doing in terms of our foreign policy in 1970. This is when the Vietnam War was happening. And in our history, the genocide of American Indians perpetrated by our government. So he was very critical of these things. One of the reasons that this is such a famous piece is this is Yoko Ono, his fellow Fluxus artist, and who is the other guy standing there? You might be too young to recognize his picture, but that's John Lennon from the Beatles. So John Lennon eventually marries Yoko Ono, right? And so John Lennon was sort of tangentially involved with Fluxus. And so this is quite a famous image of them together in front of George McCunis's work. So it became very famous because here's one of the Beatles, who are kind of the most famous people in the world at this time, standing in front of this work by a Fluxus artist. He was married to he eventually marries another artist named Elsa Knowles, who is part of Fluxus as well. And their daughter actually wrote this great book that I just read called Fluxus Experience, and I'm blanking on her name right now. But anyway, Elsa Knowles is another artist involved in Fluxus. They don't get married till much later, but this is from her work called House of Dust. This was a whole installation, and these are just some of the little pieces of what's left of this. This would have been like a performative installation where people went into the space and engaged with all these different kinds of elements in there. She's kind of known for these large works that people could interact with, these large kind of installation works. And we'll talk about installation art a little later, but this is really when installation art is just becoming a thing. It's just starting to become sort of prominent in the art world. This is one of her more famous pieces. She made this in 1967, and it was called The Big Book. And here you can see her on a stepladder inside this thing. So it was an 8-foot tall walk-in construction. Like I said, a lot of her works were kind of installations or environments that you could walk into. It had a title page and 8 movable pages anchored to a metal spine. It was possible to leaf through, to like move them, to leaf through the individual pages. And each page had an access point to the next page, opening up different spaces. So there are ways that they'd open up partially and have things connecting each page. So the book contained all these kind of strange elements. It had a stove, it had a telephone, it had a bed, it had a chemical toilet, a library, a guest book, a gallery with artworks by other Fluxus artists, a lush meadow recreated, a ventilator, and other utensils in the spaces between the pages. And it was constructed in a way that it could be packed into 2 crates for shipping purposes. It was given its first public airing in 1967 at the Something Else Gallery in Chelsea, New York, which is a place that a lot of experimental artists of the time exhibited work. Another individual who was super involved with Fluxus is Lamonte Young. And he was a composer, so he's a musician. And he's one of the first American minimalist composers, so he's later affiliated with minimalism, which we talk about in this class as well. And he is kind of a central figure in post-war avant-garde music. He's best known for his exploration of sustained tones, beginning with his 1958 composition trio for strings. And this is very similar to some of the things that John Cage would do. So he'd write these compositions where musicians would just hold one tone for as long as possible and harmonize or clash with other musicians, and those are kind of his most famous works. So very experimental kind of sound art, basically. And this is just a quote from him that I like. One of the aspects of form that I have been very interested in is stasis, the concept of form which is not so directional in time, not so much climatic form, but rather form which allows time to stand still, which I think is really interesting. And when composers become interested in time, you see a lot of emphasis on sort of, I'm not a musician, but what I would call the negative space of music, the rests in between notes, and then the sustained notes, and the idea of sound and silence and space and time and how those things interact. And so he and John Cage are both very interested in that kind of thing. Another really prominent Fluxus artist was Dick Higgins. He was an American artist, composer, art theorist, poet, publisher, printmaker, and co-founder of the Fluxus International Artistic Movement. He was a student of John Cage's, And he was an early pioneer of electronic correspondence. He did all kinds of different experimental music, experimental electronic music, and he also did art. He was also involved in happenings. He also helped kind of organize and publish a lot of Fluxus written work and thoughts. So he was a super influential guy. This is another one by Dick Higgins. So he would also do these, he was also a printmaker, he was also a screen printer. So he would do these layered kind of images that become a little bit chaotic, that are just images layered over and over again. And then he did later, so this is from the 80s, he did these kind of interesting like diagrams that were related to art and different aspects of art and music. This one is about Fluxus, but he did them about different other kinds of work. Okay, Henry Flint, sorry I'm going kind of fast, I just want to give you a little taste of this before you go experience Yoko Ono's work. Henry Flint is an American philosopher, musician, writer, activist, and artist, and he was also connected to Fluxus and the New York avant-garde in general in the 60s. He's the first guy to use the phrase concept art. So he's very important to the development of conceptualism and concept art as a kind of art, as a genre of art. He was associated with figures in the Fluxus scene. He's also very proficient on the electric violin, and he performed a lot with different Fluxus musicians, like John Cage, like Lamonte Young. Okay, let's talk about Yoko Ono. So we get to see her work at the Springfield Art Museum, which is super rad. So she's a Japanese multimedia artist, singer, songwriter, and peace activist. Her work also encompasses performance art, which she performs in both English and in Japanese, and filmmaking. She grew up in Tokyo and moved to New York in 1953 with her family. This is maybe her most famous piece. It was a performance in 1964 called Cut Piece. And this was at Carnegie Recital Hall in New York at March 21st, 1965. So she goes up on stage and she's fully clothed, and the work is being recorded, and members of the audience are invited to come up on stage and make one cut to her clothing and cut one thing to cut off her clothing as she's sitting there, and that's the performance. And so it's this idea of audience performance, it's this idea of trust in community, and there's someone who kind of violates the trust, and he just keeps cutting away, and you can tell she gets a little bit irritated. She doesn't really react to everybody, but she performs this a few different times. The one at Carnegie Hall is the most famous, and it's really one of the earlier performance work pieces. And then the video is kind of the artifact of the work, and so it is shown afterwards, and that's a kind of a new idea at this time too, to show a video of a work of art happening is a new kind of thing. She also did installation art and sculpture. So she created this piece called Half a Room, and it's in an exhibition called Half a Memory. It's in London, and so she just cut everything that would be in a room in half and created this installation where it's like half of a bathtub, half of a bed, half of this. And this is another piece of hers that's quite famous. She also did these, she called them paintings, okay? And they're like little instructions like this. So this is a painting for the wind. So, and it says, cut a hole in a bag filled with seeds of any kind and place the bag where there is wind. And that's the painting. Like, you create the situation in which the wind is painting with seeds that will eventually become flowers. And she publishes a collection of these in this book called Grapefruit, which is a book of instructions, basically. And John Lennon writes the introduction for it. So it's originally published in 1971, and then it's published again in the year 2000. Here's a couple more. Snow piece. Think that snow is falling. Think that snow is falling everywhere all the time. When you talk with a person, think that snow is falling between you and the person. Stop conversing when you think the person is covered by snow. Cloud piece. Imagine the clouds dripping. Dig a hole in your garden to put them in. So there are these really simple kind of instructions that you have this interaction usually with nature in some way. And that's the other thing that she's quite famous for, these little instructive things. She's still alive. If you follow her on Twitter, her Twitter is a lot like this. It's kind of these interesting little almost haiku-like sort of things. Okay, Joseph Beuys. So Joseph Beuys is someone I categorize with Fluxus. Other people do too. He's categorized in a lot of different ways. He's a German artist, and he does a lot of different kinds of sculpture and installation and performance. And so this is one of his performances. It's called I Like America and America Likes Me. And for this, he flies to America. He's German. He flies to America, and he's taken from the plane on a stretcher in an ambulance to a gallery. And in the gallery, he's there, and he has this felt he can wrap himself with, and he has this cane, and then there's a wild coyote in the gallery with him. And he's there, I can't remember how long, for like 24 hours or 36 hours or something with this wild animal. And then he's locked in there with it, and then there's just the glass windows of the gallery so people can watch this. And then after the time period is over, he's put back on a stretcher, put in an ambulance, taken back to a plane, and flies back to Germany. So the thing is, he only set foot inside the gallery. That's the only part of America that his feet touched. He wasn't injured or anything. He was in the ambulance just to not have his feet touch the ground. And so this is this performance activity that he does that's pretty famous. He had a really troubling life. At the age of 22, he joined the German Air Force. His plane is shot down in Crimea, and he was found by the Tatars. His condition was critical, and he was stripped naked, smeared with grease, and wrapped in felt like the wool material. This experience, which he told this story, and people questioned whether it was true or not. So whether it was real or not, it becomes the basis of Beuys' personal mythology. And he continues to use felt and use grease in his performances and his sculptures and installations throughout his life. These are kind of elements that you see in a lot of his work. He was kind of inhabited by his fervent political engagement. He believed that politics and culture must act together in order to ensure that society functions on a sound basis. Throughout his life, he fights capitalism. He's very anti-capitalism, and he wanted his art to be a therapy for a society that he considered to be diseased. So he's a very interesting artist. There's a great documentary that came out about him about 5 years ago, I think, that's just called Beuys, B-E-U-Y-S. Here's another one of his installations. I saw this when I was in Germany a few years ago, and these are just rolls of felt on a sled coming out of the back of a van. Okay, I'm trying to do this fairly quickly, so this is such a brief view of Fluxus. I'll record a longer version of this lecture later and post it. Namjoon Paik, he was a Korean-American artist, and he worked with a variety of media and is considered to be the founder of video art, so super influential. If you go to any museum or gallery now with a contemporary collection, you will definitely see video art and sound art are big things, and art that use electronic kinds of technology. He was the first person to do that, so really important, huge impact in terms of his contribution to the art world. He's also credited with the first use of the term electronic superhighway, which is kind of what telecommunications and the internet are known as. So he came up with that phrase and kind of saw the future of what the internet and what telecommunications were going to be in the future. And that he's the one who said that, and he really was kind of ahead of his time and predicted a lot of things. So he made a work titled Electronic Superhighway in 1974, and it's the US. If you look closely at this, you can see the borders of the states are in neon, but behind each of them there's a little television, and each of the televisions are showing different images and different kinds of media. So very interested in ideas about media, about intermedia, and about how technology and electronics and video technology particularly could be utilized in art. This is another one of his works called TV Garden, where he installed all of these live plants with all of these televisions in them showing the same thing. And at the time, this was very radical. Nobody had done anything like this. So he was really breaking a lot of boundaries. And he's someone who really changed the way art functions and the possibility of what art can be. And he's kind of why we have technology in our works, basically. So a super important guy coming out of Fluxus. Okay, so that's a very quick look at Fluxus. Again, I'll record a longer version of this later. I just wanted to kind of introduce you, since that exhibition is now up at our museum, and I want you to have some familiarity so you can go in and know what you're looking at. Okay, I will talk to you later.